Dear members of the W20 Summit, ladies and gentlemen, I'm extremely honored and happy to give this speech in this magnificent cultural center. And I would like to express my warmest thanks to the W20 Summit coordinators and to Mr. Pablo Aveluto, the Secretary of Culture of the nation. I think that the summit is an extraordinary project that has already showed its political and intellectual importance in connection with all the challenges surrounding women's rights. Today, I will talk about feminism and male violence. And I will start with the life and death of a young woman named Laetitia Perret, who lived in France from 1992 to 2011. Laetitia was an 18-year-old waitress. She lived in a small seaside resort on the Atlantic, 300 miles away from Paris. She was leading a very orderly, quiet life in the foster family to which she had been entrusted 6 years before. In the night of January 18th to 19th, 2011, she vanished on her way back home. At the very moment Laetitia was reported missing, her name entered the crime blotter column. The French media went into a frenzy, creating a paradox. This young woman was present because she was absent, and she was alive because she was dead. A few days later, a 31-year-old man was arrested. His car, put under seals, was stained with her blood. On February 1st, 2011, 2 weeks after Laetitia's disappearance, a part of her body was found in a pond, a few miles away from her home and that of the suspect. But what did we know exactly about Laetitia? Nothing, except that she had been kidnapped and savagely murdered. Her death had swallowed up her life. It looked as if she had been born to be killed. If you Googled her, the search engine redirected you to the name of the man who took her life. He has his personal page on Wikipedia, and Laetitia's murder has become one of the notable events of his notorious life. The life of a young woman has found its raison d'être among news items, local news, accidents, and other miscellaneous bits of news. Besides, Laetitia's fate could be a metonymy for history in general. For we remember the name of male conquerors, dictators, terrorists, and serial killers, not those of their countless victims, especially if they are women. As a historian, but also as a man and a father, I wanted to tear Laetitia away from her death, out of the TV news, out of the papers, where she was no more than an obituary. Because she was a human being, a young woman, a teenager, once a little girl and a baby in her mother's arms, it might be worthwhile to recount her life instead of her death. Laetitia was born in 1992 in Nantes, a city located 200 miles away from Paris. She had a twin sister. The baby girls grew up in a dysfunctional family in a poverty-stricken environment. Their father drank, had fits of anger, and beat his partner. Finally, in 1995, when the girls were 3, he repeatedly raped their mother under the threat of a knife. The father was arrested and sentenced to 3 years in prison. From then on, Laetitia and her twin sister were shunted around among relatives, grannies, uncles, and neighbors while paying visits to their father in jail. In 2005, at the age of 13, the two sisters were entrusted to a foster family from the middle class who lived in a small resort on the Atlantic. The tragedy of their fate is that in this foster family, there was sexual abuse. After Leticia's murder, the police established that her twin sister had been repeatedly assaulted and raped by her foster father from the beginning of her custody. The police were quickly puzzled by one fact. They found out that during the last day of her life, on January 18th, 2011, Leticia kept going along with the man who would eventually kill her. My hypothesis is that Leticia had no defense system at all. It had been deactivated when she was a baby, maybe as early as her prenatal life. When Leticia first met that man, she might have thought that he was no worse than others. For what are men? For Leticia, but also for her sister and their mother, men are people who decide what you must do, wear, say, and think. They are the ones who manipulate you, beat you, rape you, wring your neck, and kill you. Men always win, because in the end, you do what they wanted you to do. This is the pragmatic knowledge that Leticia had acquired about men in her biological and foster family. When I met with the forensic scientist who carried out the post-mortem, he explained to me that Leticia had not been killed, but slaughtered. He could establish that she was first beaten up in a burst of ultra-violence, then stabbed in the back, the chest, and the neck, finally strangled to death, and her body dismembered. And this is how a criminal case became the truth of our society. A world in which women are commonly harassed, assaulted, beaten, raped, and murdered. Leticia's death is the last link of a chain linked together by male violence. Marcel Mauss, an important French sociologist, defined the total social fact as a fact that has the capacity of exemplifying, summing up, and encapsulating all the aspects of a society. Well, Leticia's life is a total social fact. In her childhood, in her trajectory, in all her existence, and until her death, we found how our society, as well as our collective past, broken families, destitution, moral isolation, foster children, juvenile work, and male violence. Sometimes it seems to me that Leticia had been living for centuries. That is why we cannot identify Leticia's murder to a mere criminal case. A young woman slaughtered at the age of 18. This is not an anecdote, nor a true crime story. It's rather a social fact and a historical fact. Yet, there are so many Leticias today. All the missing Aboriginal women and girls in Canada, all the anonymous women who were abducted and murdered in Ciudad Juárez, Lucia Perez, who was raped and killed in Mar del Plata in 2016, Carmen Tartelton in the United States in 2007. Her husband broke into her house one spring night. He beat her with a baseball bat and soaked her with industrial lye. The attack nearly blinded her and burned her beyond recognition. Those storylines draw a femicide. A femicide is a term coined by Carol Orlock in the 70s. This is a seminal notion that includes killing witches, legal killing of wives suspected of adultery, female infanticide, marital murder, and sexual terrorism. In their landmark book, Femicide: The Politics of Woman Killing, published in 1992, Jill Radford and Diana Russell defined the femicide as a murder of a woman as a woman, because she was a woman, because something in her had to be humiliated and destroyed, whereas the term homicide is gender neutral. In My Dark Places, the writer James Ellroy, whose mother was murdered when he was 8, bitterly explained that men kill because they are intoxicated, angry, upset, frustrated, because their wife didn't want to have sex that night, or because the meat was overdone. As James Ellroy puts it, those women were considered fit for the bin, useless, guilty of having allowed the killer to kill them. How can we explain the dreadful frequency of sex crimes? Historian Jane Caputi discovered that the age of sex crime was inaugurated by Jack the Ripper in 1888 in London. This hatred for women is narrowly connected with women's emancipation. In England, in the second part of the 19th century, women gained the right to divorce, to vote at a local level, to be trained, to access the higher education system on an equal ground with boys. In a 1984 study, Barron and Strauss showed that rape rates correlate with women's status. US states in which women had the most status and social power were those in which Barron and Strauss found the highest rates of sexual assault. Therefore, sex crime can be considered a misogynistic backlash. Those ritualized femicides are a type of patriarchal terrorism. In that sense, they are political murders. In 1960, in the Dominican Republic, dictator Trujillo ordered the murder of the Mirabal sisters, known as the Mariposas, who were fighting for democracy and for the opening of the higher education system to women. Half a century later, in 2014, a mass killing occurred in Isla Vista near Santa Barbara in California. At the end of one of his many online videos, the 22-year-old killer asked his female classmates, "I'm such a nice guy. Why won't you give me a chance? I'm the perfect guy, yet you throw yourselves at obnoxious men instead of me." His unfulfilled romantic and sex life caused him to punish women for not dating him by targeting sorority members. Every year, about 1.3 million American women are victims of rape or attempted rape. As for domestic violence, and to consider just the state of Texas, 132 women were killed by their partners in 2014. The figures are roughly the same for France. In France, a woman dies every 3 days from the assault and battery perpetrated by her partner or ex-partner. The latest surveys indicate that 15% of French women will suffer a sexual assault or an attempted assault in their lifetimes. Inasmuch as sex crimes can be considered a misogynistic backlash, we see that male violence is part of a system. I think that violence stems from 4 causes: law, social inequalities, education, and culture. From law, because misogyny is sometimes rooted in legislation, so that women are subjected to men, fathers, and husbands, because the double sexual standard demands obedience and chastity from women while tolerating men's abuses. It's the case in some Islamic countries. Male violence stems from social inequalities and economic exclusion, because many women around the world lack financial independence and depend on male power or money for their subsistence. Male violence also stems from education. Parents sometimes disseminate misogyny through their education when they ask girls to serve in the household, while boys are allowed to walk around and to hang out with friends. When you keep repeating to your daughter that she's a delicate prey, while getting your son used to be considered a hunter and a leader, don't be surprised if the former behaves as a delicate prey and the latter as a hunter and a leader. And finally, male violence stems from culture, and notably mainstream culture. In his article entitled 7 Reasons So Many Guys Don't Understand Sexual Consent, David Wong estimates that 95% of the action movie cool guys molested women into loving them at least once. James Bond did, as well as Indiana Jones. It would be easy to recount the thousands and thousands of examples of so-called seduction methods. Assault them until they love you. Asking permission is a sign of weakness. Women like to be pursued and thus always played hard to get. Advertisement provides the same lessons. In a nutshell, male violence aims at destroying women's freedom and body. Many femicides are based on what I would call a misogynistic mindset. Women must serve, women must obey, women must yield, women must bring in money more than they cost. Women are free as long as men agree. In this context, intimate violence is an extreme strategy to control women's bodies. To conclude, I will ask a last question. How can we fight male violence? Throughout the world, feminism already enabled major achievements: political empowerment of women, developing female workforce, women being appointed to top management positions, including board positions and CEO. I'm convinced that developing female education, shattering the glass ceiling, increasing female political leadership are tools for fighting male violence. Reducing the gender gap will reduce gender-based violence. In China, there have been encouraging signs. A law against domestic violence has recently been voted. Roughly 700 protective orders had been issued by courts nationwide in 2016. Several provincial governments released guidelines to encourage the use of written warnings in police responses to domestic violence. But improvements are impatiently expected by Chinese women. Police warnings carry neither civil nor criminal penalties against those who refuse to comply. Moreover, the law fails to treat domestic violence as a crime. Domestic violence is deemed a civil offense unless the abuse is serious enough to violate China's penal laws. This is why we shouldn't forget that democracy, transparency, and personal freedom are necessary to protect women and girls from violence. Democracy in itself is a framework to prevent violence against women. The Me Too movement was mainly a Western revolution, from the United States to Latin America, from Spain to England, Argentina being a pioneer thanks to the Ni Una Menos campaign. In the Middle East, the reactions were scarce. In other countries, any expression of protest and grief in gender roles has been strictly forbidden. This is why gender-based violence needs a global call for action. Education of girls on the same ground as boys, awareness among men and notably leaders, empowerment of women in politics and in the workplace, prevention and repression of male violence. Above all, we need a political will in order to change minds, to train police officers and magistrates, to encourage scholarly and artistic works on patriarchy, and to nurture a global reflection on the social role of men. Let me give you an example. In Mexico, 11 women reported sexual assaults from the police. The abuse happened in 2006 after a clash between protesters and state forces in the state of Mexico. The Mexican government rejected their claim, but the fact is that the current president was at that time the governor of Mexico State. Unable to obtain justice in their country, the women took their case to the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights in Washington, D.C. Might there be today a patriarchal complicity? In the Me Too movement, very few men stepped in to testify, to take an interest in the debate, to raise awareness, or even to apologize. So I ask the question, where are men? How can we explain their unconcern towards gender gap and gender-based violence? Is it due to indifference, apathy, blindness, hostility, or self-interest? So again, where are men? Dear members of the W20 Summit, ladies and gentlemen, my speech dealt with male violence, but it also was a reflection on what masculinity is, or might be. The most unpolished chump has a theory about womanly behavior, or what women should look like. Red lipsticks, waxed legs, wearing this dress or these undies. But very few people try to figure out what a manly behavior is or might be. We all know that there are millions of dads, brothers, husbands who are outstanding. That is not the problem. The men that Leticia, Carmen, Lucia, and their sisters of suffering encountered throughout their lives, those men were manipulative, violent, and sexually aggressive. Does masculinity have to rhyme with violence? contempt for women, lesbians, and gays, worship of strength, power, money, or fast cars. Raising the question is the first step in answering it. Male violence will stop when family education is provided on equal ground. Male violence will stop when girls and boys are given the same opportunities. Male violence will stop when peace is settled, since women are the first victims of war crimes. But male violence will permanently stop when men become aware and express concern. Male violence will come to an end when men are feminists. Thank you for your attention.